Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share park ranger horror stories. First story. This story was shared by you/insomnia_storyteller. I'm a park ranger and I regret my community outreach program. I began working as a park ranger because I truly love the outdoors. Many of my fondest memories of growing up were made in the woods, exploring the miles of trails in my backyard, dragging along whatever friend I could convince to join me. I never tired of nature, constantly amazed by wildlife, foliage, and the changes in seasons. I grew to know the woods and parks around me like the back of my hand, and the only logical progression for me as I became an adult was to start working for them. My goal was to share my passion with my community, and I think this upbeat and engaged attitude coming from a young woman was refreshing, especially when compared to the stuffy old men who were occupying the other ranger positions. I moved up the ranks quickly, and gained a good reputation and rapport within the community. I worked hard to make our parks accessible and interesting, which leads me to the project in question. I decided during the lockdowns that it would be fun to set up some trail cams on the less popular paths in our local state park. These were the trails only traveled by more experienced climbers, woodsmen, and navigators. They weren't places your average family would go, but offered some of the most amazing wildlife and views thanks to their remote locations. In an effort to encourage people to use and donate to the parks, I proposed my idea to share nature's beauty with the public. My boss was hesitant at first, not wanting to disrupt the natural landscape with cameras, but when I showed him how very small they were and how they'd be almost entirely camouflaged in the trees, he changed his tune. We decided to have the cams stream 24 hours, with solar charging and remote connection. It would allow people trapped inside their homes to feel some kind of connection to the outdoors, and I was so excited my idea was being brought to life. We shared the live feed links on our social media pages in May of 2020, and at first we only had a few viewers. I would have preferred more, but if I could share the beauty with even just one person, it was worth it. As the summer wore on, our cams began picking up some interesting wildlife. We caught a mama bear and her cubs fishing on one cam a couple of times, and our feeds picked up views as our dedicated fans shared them with others. There was even a period of time when we had over 1,000 viewers at once, all watching eagle chicks hatch in the nest we'd found. Of course we kept the cameras a safe distance away so as not to disrupt them, but they allowed viewers to get a look at nature no one would normally be able to see. When schools opened back up, we had a few teachers, some even halfway across the country, showing the feeds to their class. I received praise as donations flowed into the parks department from locals and foreigners alike, all thrilled by the documentation of removed nature we were getting. My boss was thrilled. So was I. One night, we caught something strange on our mountainside cam. The camera was attached to a ledge overlooking a rock outcropping, and the forest beyond. A few months prior, this was where we had watched the mother eagle build her nest, but now there wasn't much to see in terms of wildlife. It did provide a spectacular view of the sunrises over the trees though, and many people tuned in for that. At first, we didn't notice anything odd, but one person in the chat asked, "Does anyone else see the trees moving?" Of course the replies mentioned the wind, tricks of the eye, and the like, but they went on, further describing it. No, like, the trees in the right corner. They're moving, like really moving. I looked, zooming my screen in on the spot the user pointed out. To my confusion the trees were moving. There were two large ones swaying dramatically back and forth, despite everything else nearby remaining stationary. I jumped into chat as an admin, acknowledging the comment. This movement unnerved me, as it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I tried to hide this though, explaining it could be a large bear climbing in the branches or scratching themselves on the trunks. Within a few minutes, the swaying stopped, but the strange motion played over and over in my head that night. I couldn't figure out just what was causing those trees, and only those trees, to move. The next morning I reported to work for my 6 a.m. shift and logged into the trail cams. All looked normal, and I found myself questioning if I had actually seen anything strange last night or if it had been the power of suggestion from the commenter. Then, I saw it again. This time it was much closer, and a few of the visible treetops at the base of the outcropping began to bend back and forth, swaying as if about to snap at any moment. I didn't know what to expect, but I sat glued to the cam while I waited for something to emerge from the woods. I saw a large, dark, clawed appendage grasp onto the bottom of the ledge, then another. They slammed down with such force the rocks beneath them cracked and split, as the creature pulled itself up onto the outcropping and closer to the camera. I felt as though I were right there in front of it, unable to move. In all my life I'd never see anything like it, not even in legends or drawings. It had 2 bloodshot eyes, pupils slit like a cat's, and a humanoid smile with large fangs that glistened all the way down to its chin. It was maybe 12 feet tall, but I couldn't tell for sure as it was crawling on all fours, slinking towards the camera. Its gaze never faltered as it stared directly into the lens, even 100 feet away from the well-hidden camera. Suddenly, it leapt onto its back legs and sprinted towards the hidden lens. I screamed, unable to separate myself from the screen as the unknown beast charged directly towards me. It ripped the camera off the tree, screeching as it did so, before throwing it to the ground. The camera clattered around before the feed went black and cut out. I looked at the feed, and thankfully saw no one but myself had been watching. I didn't know how to, or if I even could, explain what had just happened. I wasn't sure I wanted to, and tried to forget about it the rest of the day. Maybe I had fallen asleep at my desk and imagined it, or I had food poisoning that caused me to hallucinate. At this post I'd accept any explanation other than that there was none. That evening, another trail cam was destroyed, mysteriously going offline while, thankfully, no one was watching. Since then, we've received reports from hikers of trees moving unnaturally while they're on the trails, and all of our trail cams have gone offline. No one has been injured or even gone missing, so no one has bothered to investigate it. Most rangers say it's nothing to worry about. I, on the other hand, am full of fear. I see trees swaying on my drives home from work, and have refused every field assignment I've been requested to do. I used to jump at the chance to get out of my office. I haven't even attempted to explain why to anyone, because I don't want people to go looking for this creature. I think it knew we were watching it, and it didn't want to be seen. I'm the last thing standing in its way of remaining undiscovered, and it's most definitely intelligent enough to put a stop to that. The moving trees are getting closer, and it's only a matter of time before my feed goes dark too. Second story. This story was shared by you/the General. I'm more cautious than ever while working as a park ranger. I was in the middle of a routine patrol of the park when my radio crackled to life. The frequency didn't indicate an emergency, so I pulled my truck over to the side of the road and called into base. On the other end of the radio was Emmett, a fellow park ranger and one of my favorite coworkers. "What's up, Emmett?" I asked. "Not much, Aiden. Just got someone here who wants to know if we've seen her missing brother." "Have we? Doesn't look familiar to me, but since you're due for lunch about now, why don't you head back?" "Sounds good to me." I put the radio down, shifted the truck into drive, and headed straight back to the ranger station. It was only a 5-minute ride from my present location, and I rolled the windows down as I drove down the neatly paved roads that wound around numerous picnic areas, ponds, clusters of trees, fire pits, and pavilions complete with vending machines. It didn't take me much longer to arrive at the station, a large wooden compound with an office, numerous vehicles parked in front, and an exterior that had been freshly painted last month. I noticed that there was a gray sedan that stood out in a sea of trucks, jeeps, and golf carts for official usage. There was a spot right next to it available, so I parked there and headed inside. No matter what the weather was, the ranger station was always perfectly climate and temperature controlled. Right inside the front door, there was a sitting room filled with comfortable furniture. In two of the chairs sat Emmett and a young woman who looked close to us in age. She had curly brown hair, hazel eyes, and a slightly weary attitude that suggested she had visited many places like this. I also noticed the two of them had made good use of the nearby refrigerator that held bottled water. They both stood up when I walked inside. I saw Emmett had some papers sitting on the table beside him. "Aiden, this is Lena," Emmett introduced us. We shook hands. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Likewise. I'm just here to double check. I have no reason to be sure my brother even went this way, but I wouldn't be doing my part if I didn't ask around." I nodded. "Of course. Why don't you tell me what happened? That is, if you don't mind telling it again." She chuckled. "I've told it so many times it's second nature," she said while sitting back down in her chair. "Sadly, there's not much to tell. My brother Sam has always been flighty. So when he disappeared for a few days, no one thought a thing about it. But when a few days turned into a few weeks, that's when we started to get worried. But when we went to his last address, there was no sign anything happened. And since Sam was always bouncing around, it wasn't exactly a clear-cut case of something being wrong. So there wasn't much for anyone to go on. The only thing we were able to find out was that he was hanging out with a group of friends who were a lot like him within an hour of here. From all appearances, they were just a normal bunch of people. So you think since people just come and go here, it's entirely possible they set up camp here at some point and left, or even better, are still here?" Emmett asked. "Exactly," Lena said. "Sam always did like camping. He's the type who would be perfectly happy always traveling the country in an RV." I nodded. "Makes perfect sense why you think he might be here." Emmett turned to the papers sitting near him on the coffee table. "This is him, Aiden," he said while he selected one and handed it to me. It was one of those missing person flyers that you put up anywhere, with the phrase missing printed on the top in bold red lettering. There was also the standard contact info, but most of the flyer was taken up by a large photo of a blond man with wide hazel eyes. It took me a moment, but I could see the resemblance between Sam and Lena. I've never seen him before around here. But that doesn't mean he's never been here. Sam's a decent guy," Lena explained. "Flighty, but he's not an angry or mean type. He'd run from a fight instead of starting one." "Is that what you think happened?" I asked. "I've certainly thought about it, but I just can't see it. Like I said, he'd be perfectly happy traveling around in a basic RV. It's far more likely he got into some accident, and no one can get a hold of him. Which is another possibility of what he could be doing out here." Emmett took a sip of his bottled water. "I've double-checked the log and we don't have any record of any equipment or RV turning up here with no explanation. Apart from that, the most we could do is take another look around and ask the other park personnel to be on the lookout." "I appreciate that very much," Lena said. "My whole family would be very grateful if you kept an eye out and notified us or the police if you saw or heard anything." "Will do, Lena." Emmett stood up from his seat. "Thank you for letting us know. We have your information, and we'll let you know if we see or find anything." "Thank you. You both have a good one." She stood up, shook hands with us, and walked out the door. Moments later, there was the sound of a car starting up before tires crunched over gravel and pulled away. "What do you think?" Emmett asked now that we were alone. "We've dealt with stuff like this before." "I know. He wouldn't be the first to go missing out here, and he wouldn't be the last either." "No doubt." Then I took my time for lunch. Today, that meant I had a turkey wrap with some potato salad. Then I went back to work, taking time to keep an eye on the usual areas as I watched people walk their dogs, take hikes, or lounge about. It was a sunny autumn day, with a bright blue sky that contrasted beautifully with the occasional orange and red leaves dotting the mostly green tree line. The temperature was warm and comfortable now, but this morning was chilly, and fog blanketed the horizon as I drove to work. It wouldn't be long before both morning and night were much darker and colder. The change of seasons are always stark and captivating to see here in the woods. It wouldn't be long before the days themselves grew darker and colder, and the park was decorated for Halloween. I never failed to be part of the team that decorated and prepared for that. Since it was fall, that meant dusk settled in quicker than it had just a few weeks earlier. Before I knew it, the shadows were creeping up on the park, which meant it was time for me to politely remind people the park closed at nighttime. The wind picked up by then, which meant the few leaves that had already fallen were being scattered around. The last car had just pulled out of the lot when I locked the entrance for the general public. Then Emmett and I did the last of the closing shift checklist before we went out through the employee-only gate and called it a night. I went home, had myself some dinner, and watched some TV before I called it a night. The next morning I had an early shift, but I didn't mind since I was only working a half day. So after I grabbed myself a bagel, I drove to work. The sky was solid gray, with a hint of rain in the air, which matched what I'd seen on the weather report. The drive itself was unremarkable, so I arrived to the park in good time. But as I pulled up to the front gate, which was still locked up from the night before, I saw something. A single, solitary figure, standing just inside the front gate. What? How was that possible? We locked up the same as always, and we'd never had this issue before. Even weirder was the fact that the figure was facing away from the gate, as if watching something inside the park. I pulled off the driveway and called my boss Carlton and told him what was up. He said he'd be right there and told me to sit tight. He didn't want me walking into an unpleasant surprise, and he didn't need to tell me twice. So I waited there, never quite taking my eyes off the front gate. Which wasn't hard, since whoever was lurking there didn't move. In fact, I wasn't even sure they were aware of my presence since they hadn't reacted at all to the sound of my car. I also noticed they were dressed in clothes that looked faded and torn. After what felt like an eternity, Carlton arrived with a single cop car behind him. They parked ahead of me, and once he and the cop got out of their cars, I did the same. Then the three of us walked steadily towards the gate. It wasn't until we were right on top of the stranger that I finally got a look at who it was. It was Lena's brother Sam. My stomach clenched at the realization, but Sam showed no interest at all in what was going on. He looked at us as nonchalantly as someone walking here on a hike might glance at a tree. I quickly explained the situation and called Lena. She said she'd be here as soon as she could, and emphatically thanked us. In the meantime, the cop called for backup and an ambulance before he carefully approached Sam and assessed him. The cop decided he was no harm, so Carlton helped escort Sam to the back of his squad car. The ambulance got there before Lena did, so they were still giving him an exam when she arrived. After giving me a bone-crushing hug, Lena went over to where the medics were studying her brother. He's a bit dehydrated and hasn't eaten a decent meal for a while, but apart from that, he seems unharmed. One of the medics, a tall woman with red hair, told her. But there's no doubt he's seen something or been through something that rattled him. The other medic, an older man with a mustache, said. I've seen this type of reaction to major traumas before. And he's got all the signs. Do you have any idea what caused it? Lena asked. He shook his head. No, but I can tell you it was something that seriously frightened him. She nodded. All right. Thank you. I appreciate the insight. While that was going on, enough additional park rangers had shown up so we could search the park with the cops close behind. I had no idea what we'd find, but I felt something was wrong from the moment we set foot inside. Every time I arrived here, I felt a sense of calm and peace that came from being in the thick of nature. The scent of pine trees, the warmth of campfires, and the sounds of all the different insects making their presence known. I always found it to be relaxing and invigorating. Not this time. Today, the mood in the park felt different. Off. Like you were looking at something and could tell some aspect had been changed, but you weren't sure what. The air felt thick and heavy. I glanced at Carlton, and he looked at me, and I could tell he felt the same. On the surface everything was fine, but that didn't mean nothing happened. So we carefully set out to search every inch of the park to make sure nothing was wrong. Every time I turned a corner or opened a door, I expected to find something horrible. But it never happened. Everything turned out to be perfectly in order. Not a thing was out of place. But we couldn't figure out how Sam had gotten in. How had he done it? Eventually, we had to shrug and admit we couldn't find anything. That was when the search party called it a day and those of us that were left went to the ranger station for some water. Sam had been taken to the hospital by Lena and her parents, and we put up a sign saying the park was temporarily closed, so it was just us. Something is going on here. Emmett said after he took a long drink of water. I just don't know what. I know. But he got in somehow. You saw the state he was in. There was no way Sam forced his way in. I agree, Aiden, Carlton said, I just don't like this. I looked around the room. None of us do. Emmett was about to say something else before he stood up and looked around. Then he slowly began to walk around the room. Emmett? I asked. He briefly looked at the window before he turned to face me. Do you feel that? Feel what? The breeze. There's a draft in here. Yeah. I feel it too. One of the cops nodded his head. I think it's coming from over there. He pointed to a large file cabinet against the wall. All 6 of us walked over to it and waited. It didn't take long for me to feel a small breeze coming from around it. We all exchanged a look before Emmett and Carlton slowly maneuvered the metal cabinet away from the wall. Everyone else stood at the ready should something happen. But nothing popped out. All that happened was that the air got colder, and a section of floor opened into a hole in the ground. 2 of the cops immediately took out their flashlights and shined them into the hole. The rest of us peered behind them, and saw the hole opened up into a small cave. The flashlights revealed that the cave floor was only about a short drop from the opening. There was no ladder or anything, but it didn't look hard to maneuver. The opening was large enough for a single person to fit through at a time, so Emmett, Carlton, and I went down with the 2 cops with flashlights. They went in first, then Emmett, Carlton, and I did. The cave was uncluttered by any debris, and there was no water, so there wasn't much to look at. Not that the cave itself took much time to explore either, because before we knew it, we were facing the other end of the cave that turned into a dead end. The 2 cops shined their flashlights around, but there was nothing to see. We all had a last look around before we headed back the way we came. I had no idea what to think. My mind was a jumbled haze of thoughts as we reached where the opening was, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Because of the angle of where the opening was and how the cave was laid out, there was a wall set back a few feet from the opening, and there was something written on the wall that wasn't visible from above. "We see you." It was written in red paint with giant letters that could not be missed or misread. The exclamation point in particular was drawn with particular embellishment, as if whoever had done it had enjoyed it immensely. We all looked at it in shock before one of the cops took a picture of it. Then he turned to the rest of us. "No need to linger down here any longer." Carlton immediately pointed to Emmett and myself, so Emmett helped me up to the opening, and once I was back inside the ranger station, I helped him out. Once we helped Carlton out, the two cops quickly maneuvered themselves out before we moved the file cabinet back over the cave opening. Then we all sat back down in silence. The air was tense and heavy, and I felt a faint prickle of fear on the back of my neck. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't like whatever it was. And neither did anyone else. We would have noticed that cave opening before. Especially with all the recent maintenance work. "Okay." The cop who took the picture turned to Carlton. He was tall, lean, and had closely cropped blonde hair. "Something is going on here, and until we get to the bottom of it, I suggest you close up shop for today." "Fine by me," Carlton muttered. "Let's get out of here." We hustled out of there before Carlton locked it up tight. Then we all got in our respective vehicles and pulled out after locking up the gate tight. As a precaution, they agreed to have a cop car parked there for the night. I wasted no time in heading for home. But when we all drove away, I swear I thought I saw what looked like a figure in black clothing peering at us from behind a massive tree. When I looked back, there was nothing there. It could have been a prank, or it could have been just my imagination. Either way, I wasn't going back there to find out. Because I couldn't stop thinking about the message on the wall. "We see you," as in more than one person is watching you. The cops never did find out what was going on, or how Sam had gotten in. But sometimes when I was out on patrols after that, I would swear someone was watching me. I could feel the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and I would get that stomach-churning certainty that something was off, but every time I turned around, nothing was ever there. One time, late at night, I even thought I saw someone following me, but when I went to check, no one was there. But no matter what, I never stopped checking that nothing was there. No one did. Because periodically, we would find something had been moved or altered in some way. Sometimes it was barely noticeable, but that didn't mean we didn't notice. We also had the opening to the cave boarded up. But I can't help but wonder if there are more tunnels just like that elsewhere in the park. Third story. This story was shared by you/the General. I found a cave while working as park ranger. I was out on a routine job patrolling a remote area of the park when I saw it. The small but unmistakable opening of a cave. Since it wasn't on any of the maps and it was my job to check things like that out, I wasted no time in taking out my flashlight and heading towards the smaller, but manageable cave opening that was wide enough for me to step through without having to crouch down. The cave was situated in a clearing close to a pond. The opening was located right in the middle of a wall of sandstone and was fairly unremarkable looking. No sign that it was dangerous or out of the ordinary. Since the opening was barely wide enough for several people to step through, that meant the cave had never been turned into a mine. There was also no garbage lying around or any other traces of recent human activity. So for all I knew, I was the first human being to set foot in this cave in who knows how long. The feeling came with a sense of exhilaration I'd never felt before. So I took a deep breath, switched on my extra-strength flashlight and steadily started walking inside. My first few steps in the cave were beyond cautious. Aside from the fact I'd never been here before, the terrain was very steep. You could feel it slowly descending further into the earth. Since I didn't want to lose my footing and go tumbling down, I kept casting the flashlight beam around. Because despite the intense glaring light it provided, the darkness in the cave was unlike anything I had ever seen before. I'd been in the forest at night many times, but this far exceeded that. This darkness was dense. After enough careful steps, the descent became smoother, and the floor leveled out. The cave floor itself was rough in some spots and smooth in others. You could tell where the elements had weathered away parts of the land and made a smoother path to walk. The temperature had also dropped significantly down here, and I could now see the many impressive stalactites and stalagmites dotting the cave. The rough descent had been replaced by a fairly even path straight forward, but there wasn't a ton of space to walk around here. A small group of people could squeeze through, but no more than that. My boots occasionally crunched on gravel, but apart from that, the cave floor was empty. Almost uncannily clean. Seeing how untouched the cave was, it can't help but make you feel like an insignificant speck in the vast scheme of the universe. The cave was not only far older than I was, it would be here long after I was gone. Especially because the cave seemed endless. The more I explored, the more I got the sense that I was making no progress at all. A look at my watch told me I'd been down there for about an hour when the narrow path opened into a massive chamber and the sight made me gasp. The entire space was filled with water, and the walkway served as a makeshift bridge to the other side. The walls were rough-hewn and jagged virtually everywhere you looked. There had been plenty of impressive stalactites in the cave, but the ones dangling from the ceiling here were massive. So precise and sharp-looking it seemed impossible that they had occurred naturally. Some of them were practically touching the water that filled the space. I had no idea how deep the water was, but in the thick darkness, it looked unnervingly deep. The walkway that went from one side of the cavern to the other got rougher here, but it still looked as steady and weathered as before. So, being more careful of where I stepped than ever, I slowly began to cross the cavern. I was almost halfway across when I heard the sound of a rock hit a cavern wall and splash into the water. The sound in the empty space seemed so uncannily loud I almost jumped. Once I was sure of my footing, I carefully shined the flashlight around to check. There was nothing. No signs that anything at all had happened. But on this job, you learn that just because everything looks fine doesn't mean nothing is going on. The hair standing up on the back of my neck told me everything I needed to know. I didn't dare take another step forward. If anything, I was slowly adjusting my footing to turn back around. I was just about to go back the way I came when I heard it. The sound of whispered voices. At first, I had no idea what it was. I hadn't heard a single sound before now aside from my own footsteps. Ignoring the chill slowly washing over me, I slowly began to walk back across the cavern. I'm not sure if it was just my imagination, but as I did, the whispering got louder. The creepiest part was how the voice seemed faintly familiar. Not enough so I recognized it, but enough that it was unsettling. The worst part was that I had absolutely no idea where the voice was coming from. The acoustics of the cave made it seem like the voice was both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I was almost completely across the cavern when I cast my flashlight around and saw it. There, on the left side of the cavern in the middle of the dark water, was a shadow. With my heart pounding in my chest and the grip on my flashlight slick from sweat, I carefully turned and aimed the beam directly at it. The water illuminated was a murky gray, but the shape was as dark as it had been without the flashlight. I had no idea what the shape was. It was completely solid, but it wasn't any sort of animal, and it didn't look remotely human. It just hung there, floating just below the surface. If there had been the slightest suggestion of human activity here, I'd say it was garbage, a blanket, or some clothing that fell in the water. But I knew that wasn't the case. The sight made my stomach clench. But then, with my flashlight still aimed right at it, it disappeared. There was no movement or any disturbance in the water. It just vanished. That was my cue to leave. Once I was safely across the cavern and on solid ground, I ran out of there as fast as I could due to the numerous rock formations I had to maneuver around. It seemed to take an eternity. I periodically checked behind me to make sure there was nothing there, and while there never was, I could never shake the feeling that something was watching me. After what seemed like a painfully long time, I finally arrived back at the cave opening. Then came the difficult task of maneuvering what was essentially an uphill climb. By now I was drenched in sweat and the climb did nothing to help that. But taking care with where and when I stepped, I eventually was standing at the mouth of the cave with daylight coming through. I gratefully walked out into the sunshine and looked down into the cave. As I did, I swear I saw a figure walk past on the cave floor below. But when I looked back, it was gone. Once I caught my breath, I radioed the cave discovery into the station and some other rangers came out to check it out. One of them was my boss, Jack. I told them I didn't see anything, but one look at me and my demeanor told them something was up. Jack was no stranger to the unusual things park rangers can and do encounter on the job. So with him and the other 2 rangers listening, I told them what I saw and experienced down in the cave. When I was done, Jack sat there quietly for a moment. Doesn't matter if it's 2022 or 1822, things still go bump in the night, he said in his deep, steady voice. I don't disagree. I muttered. I'm sure you don't, Wade. I won't pretend I saw what you saw, but I believe you saw what you saw. Nature can be, and often is, a very scary place. No kidding. One of the other rangers agreed. There's a reason this cave looked so untouched by people. No sign of animals either. None. Jack shook his head at that. That's the sign something is off. Animals don't go near something, that means people shouldn't either. So we'll mark this cave as dangerous, go back to base, and log the find. Now let's get out of here. 4th story. Why I quit my job as a park ranger. Hello everybody, my name is Denver Dark, I'm 19 years old, fresh out of high school, working as a park ranger at Caledon State Park in Virginia. My job is pretty easy, I don't usually patrol the park, my job is to sit in a radio room and wait for people to call in if they need assistance. This can range from someone needing the bathroom door unlocked to a drunken fight. A couple of months ago though I had an encounter with some type of creature or maybe even an alien, I'm not sure at this point. This forever scarred me and I will always be paranoid of the forest. It was a normal evening at the park. I looked over at the clock on my desk as it clicked over to 6 p.m. Well, here goes to another night by myself, I said out loud as I saw all of the other park rangers packing up to leave. Another hour passed and as I was eating my dinner, static started coming through the radio. After a couple of seconds of just the static, a girl's voice started to come through. Hello? Hello? Is anyone there? I paused for a second after chewing another bite of my food. I had never heard anything like this over the radio before, so I picked it up. Hello, this is Officer Dark here. Yes, she yelled before continuing her sentence. Please help me. Something is chasing me. I was dumbfounded. The creepy part was she didn't say, someone, she said, something. I quickly calmed myself before responding. "Calm down, miss, tell me where you are so I can send help out immediately." "I'm at the old watchtower on the northeast side of the park. I ran here after it chased me out of my cabin. Please send help, I think it's close." "It's alright, miss, I'll send help out im dash." I was cut off by her SHH. I stopped talking, listening to the radio. Then I heard a very soft but aggressive growl come from the speaker. "Oh God, it's here." As she finished her sentence, I heard a crash of a window and a large thud on a wood floor. The radio cut out. I was in complete shock. Did I just witness someone die? After about a minute of me being absolutely glued to my seat with terror, I started to gather a plan in my head. I spun around in my chair and grabbed the old park map off of the desk next to me. I unfolded it, frantically scanning it, looking for an old watchtower. There it was, on the northeast side of the park, just like she said. To the looks of it, it would take me about an hour to walk there. I got up from my chair and walked over to the gun cabinet, unlocking it with the keys I had in my pocket. I grabbed the first gun I saw, a 12-gauge shotgun along with some extra shells. I also saw the flare gun on the top shelf and decided to take that too. Before leaving the station, I made sure that I had everything that I needed. Shotgun, flare gun, flashlight, radio, pocket knife, and the map. I'm not gonna lie, I was scared to go out into the woods after that whole event. I also hated the idea of being alone, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. As I exited the station, I was greeted by the cool breeze and a beautiful sunset of a summer evening. All of the night bugs and animals started to come out. I could hear the calling of the cicadas in the trees, while the crickets buzzed below them on the ground. It's weird because you wouldn't think that such a breathtaking scene could hold such horror that the lady experienced. Since it was a long walk, I started moving at a faster pace than I normally would. As I was about 10 minutes away from the tower, everything changed. Once an amazing sunset now turned the forest into a pitch black that no person could see into. Along with the deafening sound of silence as the cicadas and crickets stopped chatting. This was extremely odd. I had been in this forest many times at night and nothing like this had ever happened. A few more minutes of walking later and I saw the old watchtower. It was about 70 feet tall or so, with a hut at the top of it. The watchtower had seen its better days. The wood looked very old, with it being damp and cracked in many spots. At this point I was at the base of the tower. Right before I was about to go up on the first step, I got the worst feeling I have ever felt. My head started to spin. I was very nauseous and started to see stars. As this continued, I thought I was gonna pass out. As the darkness around my eyeballs started to grow, everything stopped. I was normal again. Except for one feeling, it felt like something was staring at me. I swear I could feel its eyes piercing into the back of my head. Its glare almost felt sharp, like a knife had been jammed into my side. I spun around as quickly as I could, holding the shotgun in front of me. Nothing. There's nothing, I thought. Until I scanned the tree line in front of me about 50 or so feet out. Oh my gosh, I let out as I see deep in the forest. A pair of two vibrant green eyes staring at me. I was struck with fear, my eyes not being able to leave the sight, my feet almost cemented in the ground. After about a minute of me staring at it, it winked at me. It winked at me. After this the eyes disappeared and went back into the brush. I didn't know what to think. The only thing that I knew was not to stay in that spot. I ran up the old wooden stairs as fast as I could. But then I remembered the radio call I had gotten earlier. I prepared myself for a bloody scene. But when I reached the top of the steps, the hut was empty, no blood, no body, no lady. The most disturbing thing of all though was it looked like this place hasn't been touched in years. The floors and desk in the room were both completely covered in cobwebs and dust. A large radio sat on the desk. It must have been the one that came through to mine, but that too was engulfed by the webs. Something very strange is happening. I just couldn't figure it out. On the edge of the desk was a stack of very old newspapers. My curiosity took over and I picked one up. Date, 1978, headline, Woman attacked and killed by the Wampus cat, locals say. This didn't make any sense. This couldn't be the same lady I just contacted. I needed to find out more, so I kept on reading. The next thing that I read sent shivers down my spine. The Wampus cat resembles a very large black panther. Most known for their very bright green eyes. My blood ran cold. I needed to get out of this place right now. Right as I shoved the newspaper into my pocket and was ready to run. It was too late. Before I could turn around, I heard a sound. That same damn bone-chilling growl I had heard on the radio. I turned around as fast as I could, raising my shotgun. There it was, the beast itself. The Wampus cat. This cat was massive, quite possibly the biggest mammal I had ever seen. It stood on all fours at a staggering height of at least 8 feet tall. It had deep old scars all over its body, probably from people like me. Its paws were the size of small dinner plates, and didn't forget its face. The lips were completely barred back, showing its dinner knife-like fangs, and the most important thing of all, those dang green eyes almost staring into my soul. I didn't waste any time and pulled the trigger, sending a slug at my target. I landed the shot, but it barely did anything. The cat staggered back when the slug hit him, but that's about it. How is this thing still alive? The round had left a bloody hole in its torso about the size of a dollar coin, but alas, the creature was pretty much unfazed. I decided to run for it, booking it to the exit, only to be stopped by the huge feline pouncing on my back and pinning me to the wood floor. The beast raked its long claws across my back, leaving an extremely painful wound. It felt like I was being burned with a hot iron. I could feel my shirt already being soaked with blood. I managed to flip around on my back to face the beast, holding its head away from my face. Although I was able to keep its head at bay, I wasn't with the paws. It started swiping at my face, leaving those searing claw marks on me again. I tried to reach for the shotgun on the ground next to me, but I wasn't able to. Blood from the gashes started to seep into my eyes, stinging them, not allowing me to see. With nothing working and all of the blood I was losing, I started to give up. There was no point, I couldn't overpower this thing. And right when I was about to give in, thinking about all of my friends and family, an idea sparked into my head. I reached in my pocket and pulled out the knife I had forgotten about. I flipped the blade open and immediately stabbed the cat in the neck with it. The beast reared back in pain, leaping off of me. This was my only chance to escape. I quickly got up and snatched the shotgun before sprinting down the stairs. I had a head start, but the cat was catching up. As I reached the bottom, it was already halfway down. I didn't have any time to spare. I ran immediately to the trails, not looking behind me. I could hear the big heavy footsteps of the beast on my tail end. I knew eventually it was gonna catch up, so I turned around, pumping 2 more slugs in it, staggering it again. I could tell it was hurt because it was moving a lot slower. I fired again in its direction, landing another shot with a bloody splat. Then the cat stopped running, turning around and slowly jogging the other direction. It finally gave up. This didn't stop me from sprinting back to the station. I used every bit of strength and willpower to make it back. As I busted through the door of the building, the biggest wave of relief came over me. I had won. I had beaten that thing. After attending to my wounds and grabbing a glass of water, I sat down in my desk chair, thankful to be alive. While reaching into my pocket to take out my phone, I felt paper. Ah, the newspaper. I pulled it out, scanning the article once again, realizing that I missed something before. The woman's body was found in the watchtower of Caledon State Park, her body being mutilated, even missing some of her limbs. Even though she was killed, many of the people in the park say they can still hear her calling for help, just like that same night she was murdered. I was completely shook. I didn't know what to think. Was it a ghost or maybe a spirit? And right as I put the newspaper down, the radio buzzed, playing that same voice that started this all. Hello. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/horror_writer_1717. I'm a park ranger who never believed the stories about the abandoned mining town. Until I'm a park ranger out in Nevada. There was an old, abandoned mining town that sat a ways off the main road. The Park Service had claimed it a while back, but people were not encouraged to visit there. In fact, it was plainly marked with signs that said, "Off limits, no trespassing, danger." Hell, about the only thing they didn't do was build a moat around the place. Sometimes I wonder if they should. Some people need to learn to read or listen, one of the two, because it seemed like I was always chasing people out of there. They'd look at me like I was crazy, but every one of them would spray gravel as they hauled ass after I'd tell them the story. I'm not supposed to tell the story. I've been warned many times. Even threatened with much worse than the unemployment line. I guess maybe I need to learn how to listen too. But it was the best way to make sure people left and never came back. I'm tired of being told to keep my mouth shut. I'm tired that nothing's been done about it. We rangers are supposed to just go about our jobs and pretend it never happened. Well, I believe that's the best and quickest way for it to happen again. And I never want it to happen again. It was a while ago. That's my way of saying I forget how long ago it was, but the memory's still fresh enough to tell. It was back when even I was unsure why the town was off limits. I'd heard old wives' tales and urban legends, but no one would ever commit to anything concrete. I asked around once and was told that I was better off not knowing. The old rangers would just tell me to mind my business and stay out of town. But something about it always intrigued me. I was never good at blindly following orders, so as often as I could, I'd find some excuse to drive past it. On that day it was a good thing I did. Or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. I noticed a small mobile home parked at the edge of the town. I knew it hadn't been there the day before. I pulled up behind it and got out of my truck. I scanned the area around and didn't see anything moving that the wind wasn't blowing. I walked around the vehicle and it seemed to be in good shape. None of the tires were flat. There seemed to be no good reason for them sitting there unless they were sightseeing. I peeked in the windshield but couldn't see anyone, so I went to the side door and knocked. "Park Ranger," I said. "Anybody in there?" The wind whistling was my only answer. I knocked again. "Park Ranger. Is everyone all right?" No answer. I pulled on the door latch, and it opened. "I'm coming in," I said. "Just need to check to make sure everyone's okay." I pulled the door open and stepped inside. Unconsciously I rested my hand on my sidearm. I closed the door behind me, leaving the wind outside. I looked around the camper and found plenty of food and supplies. They seemed to be well stocked for a trip. I stepped back toward the bedroom, keeping an ear open for anything. It was eerily silent. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my boots on the linoleum as I headed back the short hallway. It wasn't a long walk until I got there. The bedroom was clean, and the bed had been made. I opened a few drawers and found clothes for a man and a woman. There was no sign of a struggle, so I went back out to the kitchen, stopping to open the bathroom door and find two kids' toothbrushes and toothpaste sitting on the sink. Just like the bedroom, everything seemed to be in its place. I noticed the hand towel holder was empty. I looked on the floor to see if it had fallen, but the towel was just gone. I shrugged it off and went back out to the kitchen. The table was still folded down into a bed, as these smaller models were known for. Scanning around, I was hard-pressed to find anything out of the ordinary, except for the fact that no one was there. I stepped outside and the sun had disappeared. It would be dark soon. I looked around but didn't see anyone. It was as if they parked the camper at the edge of town and went for a walk. I stepped out of the camper and turned to close the door. That was when I saw it. There was a small dot of red on the step. I leaned closer and it looked like it could be dried blood. I tried to dismiss it as nothing. People drip blood every day for simple, non-threatening reasons. Nosebleeds, small cuts, general accidents, it could be absolutely nothing. But, when you add in a missing family at the edge of an abandoned town that's supposed to be off-limits, normal things don't look so normal. I didn't touch it in case it needed to be tested later for a DNA sample. And there it was. I was already starting to look at this as a crime scene. I looked down at the ground and saw my boot prints in the dirt, leading up to the camper. I also saw other tracks. There was another set of adult boot prints, a set of adult sneakers, and two different sets of smaller sneakers. Those were spooky but comforting. At least I knew these people were here somewhere. They hadn't just vanished from inside the camper. No, it was the other footprints that gave me chills. They were adult-sized and it looked like there was more than one of them, but the creepy thing about them was they were bare feet. I couldn't imagine anyone who lived in the area being stupid enough to walk around the desert in their bare feet. Aside from the different types of scorpions, there were also snakes, spiders, and lizards, just to name a few. It was becoming more likely that I would find this family dead from stupidity. I followed the barefoot tracks and they seemed to lead around the corner of the camper. In fact, they did several laps around the camper, with frequent stops where the feet were pointed toward the camper as if looking inside. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. This family had been stalked. I stepped in a wider circle so I wouldn't disturb the footprints. It became more apparent by the minute that this was a crime scene. I pulled out my radio to call in my position and request backup or police. But my radio was strangely silent. It didn't even click when I released the talk button. The light was lit, so I knew the battery was charged, it just wasn't transmitting. The smart thing to do just then would have been to get in my truck and drive to the station to report what was happening. I took one step toward the truck. That's when I heard the scream. It was a woman's scream, high and piercing. It was a scream of pain and anguish. As if her whole world had come crashing down. My fight or flight kicked in and there wasn't an ounce of flight in it. In a heartbeat, my gun was in my hand. I turned toward the town and began following the footprints. Once they were done circling the camper, they headed straight into town. Dusk had faded and taken the light with it. I pulled my flashlight off my belt and used it to guide me on my trail. There were a half-dozen buildings all in some level of decay. I was worried about stepping into one and it just collapsing on top of me. That aside from the chance of meeting a scorpion or some other creature that didn't appreciate being disturbed in their territory. The wind had died down and the air was still. It was so quiet, I could hear my own footsteps. There was something else too. I felt a vibration in the air. At the time I thought it was just my heightened senses at the prospect of meeting up with a dangerous person who may have harmed that family. Even though everything within me was demanding I run towards the scream I'd heard, my steps were slow and measured. I needed more input. I needed to know how many people I was dealing with. I needed to identify threats and if I would be able to deal with this without becoming a victim myself. As I approached the first building, I had a strong feeling of being watched. Stepping on the porch made the boards creak threateningly. I didn't want this to end with a broken ankle or worse. I tested the boards before putting full weight on them and slowly approached the broken windows. I shone my light inside. I panned around slowly, finding a bunch of old boxes and general junk with the odd wooden chair and table. I was about to move on when back in the far corner I saw a pair of eyes lit by my flashlight. I froze, my light locked on it. The eyes seemed to be locked on the light as well. I couldn't tell what it was, but it scared the hell out of me. I suddenly thought of the movie I'd recently seen, Jurassic Park. When the actor was explaining how raptors attack. How one will draw your attention while two more sneak up on you and attack from the side. I suddenly felt very vulnerable, as if someone was sneaking up behind me. I whipped around, pointing with my gun and flashlight, my eyes darting all around. But I couldn't see anything. I shone my light back inside, but the eyes were gone. This didn't comfort me, in fact, it did the opposite. I was in a panic. I felt like I was surrounded, and they were just toying with me. I didn't even know who they were. I took a few deep breaths to get myself under control. I knew panic led to bad decisions, and I couldn't afford any bad decisions out here on my own. I shone my light back toward the camper and saw a shadow dart out of the light. I knew it was all or nothing. There was no backing out. I was being hunted, just like that family had been. I didn't know what was hunting me, but it didn't matter. Whoever or whatever, it was dangerous. Focus, I told myself. Stay on your toes, remember your training. Even though my training also said don't get yourself in a bad situation. It was already too late for that. Something was near the camper. I still had no idea if this family was dead or alive. The only things I had to go on were mysterious footprints and a scream. It was the stuff of every horror movie ever made. I just hoped I didn't end up as one of the victims that died a horrible gory death to save some stupid teenagers who risked their own lives by blundering into something they should have left alone. I sighed, turned my light back to the ground, and followed the footprints. I noticed for the first time there were other marks among the footprints. They had been walked over and obscured, but it looked like two long lines like someone was being dragged. I brought my flashlight back up just in time to see a set of eyes disappear behind a building on the other side of the street. I stepped up to the next building and shone my light inside to find much the same as the first, minus the eyes. I didn't linger long before turning my light back out to the streets and the other buildings. I felt like it somehow kept them at bay. As if they would work their way closer to me if I didn't shine my light their way. I didn't know how long this would last. I continued to the next building with a larger building looming larger at the end of the street. It looked like it was an old church. There was the rough shape of a steeple that had partially collapsed. I turned and flashed my light back to the street to keep the hunters back. When I stepped up to the window of the next building and shone my light inside, I found bones. Piles of bones. Most looked like they were from smaller animals, but there were larger ones interspersed with them. I was sure I spotted a couple of human femurs. I tried my radio again, but it still wasn't working. The vibration in the air was getting stronger. It was oppressive like the pressure you feel when you're underwater. The stillness in the air magnified any sound. I could hear the footsteps of someone behind me. But when I turned, I couldn't see anyone. I left the bone storage building and headed for the last building at the end of the street, the church. I walked up to the doors, and they were very plain. Two wooden doors, no Gothic architecture, no cross, just a couple of wooden doors that looked like they were about to fall off their hinges. I hesitated, turned, and looked back down the street. I knew they were there but couldn't see them. This was where they'd been hurting me all along. I held my gun and flashlight at the ready, knowing I was in for a fight as soon as the doors opened. I took a deep, cleansing breath, then shoved the doors open. I shone my light all around, my eyes darting to all the dark corners. Except they weren't dark. There were candles lit all around. It was quite beautiful. It was also quite empty. There was no one there. Even empty and well lit, it gave off a creepy vibe. Why do empty churches always do that? You would think it would be the opposite. My senses went on high alert. I didn't trust it. It must be a trap. As I continued to scan back and forth, looking for any hiding spots among the pews, I noticed there was one person there. In the first pew, bent over so I could barely see them. I slowly made my way forward, head on a swivel as I approached the lone figure. When I was nearly there it looked like they were barely breathing. I came around in front of the creature and aimed my gun. She looked up at me. She was naked and her hands and mouth were bound. As soon as she saw me, she started screaming into the gag in her mouth. She was screaming so hard her face turned red. I reached down and slid the gag off her mouth. "It's a trap," she screamed. I looked up and saw my worst nightmare. There were creatures, dozens of them. Each one looked vaguely human, but they were deformed. There was one that had one healthy arm and a second that was shriveled up. One had only a single leg but still managed to hop toward me. Another had no legs but used its arms to crawl on the floor. None of them had a full set of teeth, but they all had a look of hunger and rage in their eyes. They came from everywhere, some even crawled their way down from hiding places in the ceiling, like some horrific Spider-Man. They swarmed toward the front of the church. I looked around for anywhere to go, anywhere to hide, when I locked eyes on a door that looked like it was a closet. "Come on," I said, grabbing her arm and dragging her over to the door. "No, I can't, please don't make me," she said, tugging against me. "We go in here or we die," I said, cutting the ropes around her wrists and putting my jacket over her shoulders. She reluctantly came along with me as the horde of creatures was nearly on us. "Quick," I said, opening the door and shoving her through. I slammed it shut behind me, taking out my knife and jamming it into the wooden doorframe to keep it shut. I turned and nearly ran her over. She hadn't moved. She was standing there staring into the dark. I shone my flashlight in front of us and saw a rickety staircase descending into the darkness. Please don't make me go down there," she whimpered. "We don't have a choice," I said. "They'll be through this door soon." The pounding had gotten louder. She turned toward the door, then pulled my jacket closer around her and took a deep breath. I stepped around her and led the way, shining my light all around trying to make sure we wouldn't run into any surprises. The boards creaked menacingly with every step I took. I couldn't see what was underneath but had no desire to find out the fast way. I looked back and she was still staring down. I held my hand out and she slowly took one step then another. Her bare feet were filthy. I wondered if she was getting splinters as she took each step slowly and gingerly as if walking on hot coals. After she had taken a few steps, I turned back to guide our way. The stairway was long and attached to an uneven stone wall. At some points, it jutted out far enough I had to squeeze around to get to the next step. It was getting colder as we descended. I started missing my jacket but knew she needed it more. The spiderwebs weren't helping my anxiety either. I wondered if they were made by the deadly breed. I glanced back and saw she was still working her way down the stairs. When I looked forward again, there was a creature coming up the stairs toward me. I didn't think, just reacted. I barely had the gun pointed until I fired. The creature fell back with shock frozen on its face and tumbled down the stairs. I instantly regretted my action as my ears were already ringing from the gunshot in such an enclosed place. I turned around to check on her, but she was curled up in the fetal position sitting on a step, ears covered, rocking back and forth. "It's okay," I tried to say, but my voice sounded strange. "I guess temporary deafness will do that." At least I hoped it was temporary. She didn't look at me. I was unsure if she had heard me, so I touched her shoulder and she immediately recoiled and climbed several stairs, backing away. I bent down to her. "Look, I know you're scared, I would be too, but if we're going to get out of this, we have to do it together. If I'm going to have to check on you every few steps, we'll be helpless if another one of those things attacks." "I don't want to go down there," she stammered. I looked ahead and then back at her. "We have no choice." I turned and started down the stairs again. After around a dozen steps, I turned to see she had stood and was slowly making her way down again. I kept going until I made it to the bottom and kicked the corpse of the creature out of our way. I looked around, but there wasn't much to see. It was a passageway made of the same rough-cut rock walls and a dirt floor. I turned to see her make it to the last step. Her eyes were wide with fear. I could only imagine what she had already been through. She looked away as she stepped past the corpse. I decided to make a little conversation as we walked down the endless passageway to get her to focus on something other than our situation. "You're from the camper, aren't you?" I said. She nodded absently as she stared at the floor. "Were you going on vacation?" Another nod. I saw the kids' toothbrushes on the bathroom sink. "How many kids do you have?" Her eyes glazed over. "2 boys. And your husband is with you?" She nodded. "Where were you headed?" "Vegas." "What made you stop here?" The kids wanted to see the abandoned town. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, making lines on her face. "Would you like me to stop talking?" She nodded. We continued forward in silence. The chill of the place made me shiver, but not just because of the temperature. The thought of being attacked at any moment was more than keeping me on my toes, it was wearing on my nerves. After some distance, we came to an opening that stretched out into a full room. She stopped and stared. I was puzzled at first until I noticed the smell. It was the stench of death. I shone my light around the room. The first corner I came to held a pile of bones. There was no denying these ones were human. They were large and the right shape. There were even a couple of full torsos still together that hadn't deteriorated yet. In the next corner, there were 3 bodies hanging from the dirt ceiling. It looked like a man and 2 boys. They had been strung up by their arms and were covered in blood. There were innumerable cuts and puncture wounds, but the most horrid sight were the many bites that were taken out of them. She collapsed and began to sob. I knew right away this was her family. "I'm so sorry," I said. She looked at me with a mix of hopelessness and rage. "I tried to tell you not to come down here," she said with quiet forcefulness. "I'm sure we can find some way to." She shook her head violently. "You don't understand," she said, looking me straight in the eyes for the first time. "This is the trap." She stood up straight for the first time since I had seen her in the church, took off my jacket, and tossed it behind her. She was beautiful, even though she was covered in filth. "My children need food," she said, stretching out her arm. In an instant 2 deformed creatures appeared and stood beside her. She stroked the thinning hair on their heads as they cooed at her. "So, there was no woman in the camper?" I said, trying to stall for time until I could come up with a plan. "Oh, no, there was a woman. She was taken to the birthing house. She will give my children their own children. Against her will, of course." She looked at me with disdain. "She is a tool we will use to survive, just like my ancestors were treated as tools to be used in the mines." I glanced around the room and saw several more creatures emerge from the shadows and advance slowly toward me. I knew I was trapped. My mind scrambled for some plan, any plan to escape the horrors that waited for me. I glanced at the 3 bloody mangled bodies dangling from the ceiling and knew that would be my fate. I made my decision and didn't hesitate to implement it. In a flash, I drew my pistol and shot her in the forehead. The sound was still echoing when I started to run back to the passageway I had come from. I hoped that the shock of seeing their mother die would give me a head start before the horde of creatures hunted me down and tore me to shreds. Time seemed to move in slow motion. I felt like I was running underwater, every move, every step seemed incredibly slow. I knew they would catch me, there was no doubt in my mind, it was only a matter of time. The only thing that kept me from giving up was the sheer will to live. I swung the flashlight as I ran, making shadows jump and fly around. I arrived at the bottom of the stairs much sooner than I thought possible and threw myself up them 2 at a time, praying that I didn't trip. The horde was hot on my heels. I could hear them getting closer. The grunts and snarls spurred me on even faster. I felt something brush against my heel and knew I had to act. I didn't bother to look back, I fired 2 shots into the closest one. I heard the inhuman scream and the sound of falling bodies. I risked a glance back to see them all tumbling down the stairs. I breathed a sigh of relief as I reached the door and struggled to pry my knife out of the wood. After a few agonizingly long seconds, it came free, and I dove through the door. Much to my surprise and relief, the church was empty. They must have all gone another way to trap me below. I looked over at the dozens of glowing candles and ran straight toward them, knocking over as many as I could. I ran to the far wall and did the same on my way out the door. Once I was through, I turned back and jammed my knife into the doors so they wouldn't open. I didn't waste time celebrating my close escape. I ran down the middle of the street so I would have a good view of anyone or anything chasing me. It didn't take long until I heard footsteps behind. They sounded more like a pack of dogs chasing me. I glanced back and sure enough, there were a half-dozen deformed creatures in hot pursuit against the backdrop of the church engulfed in flame. I took some solace in the fact that at least some of the unnatural bastards must have burned up in the blaze. I had a stitch in my side and my leg muscles burned, but I didn't dare slow down. Even at the speed I was running, they were catching up. I wasn't sure if I would make it to the truck before they got me. It was going to be close. I reached the truck and breathed a sigh of relief that I hadn't locked it. By the time I got the keys in the ignition and started it, they were on me. I locked the doors and slammed it into reverse as the first body flew into my windshield, shattering it. I got some momentum going as another landed on my hood and another grabbed my door handle. I swung the truck around and slammed on the brakes, sending them flying. I threw it in drive and stomped on the gas, spraying gravel. I hadn't gone more than a few yards when another freak landed in the truck bed and started pounding on the cab roof. I could see the dents getting deeper. It would be through soon. Suddenly the pounding stopped. I kept my eye on the road but turned to see what was happening. It smashed through my rear window, grabbing me by the neck. I swerved to try to break its grip, to no avail. I could feel myself starting to black out. I knew that would be a death sentence. I pointed my gun out the window, but the creature grabbed it before I could aim at its head. My mind raced faster than the truck that was hurtling down the dirt road at breakneck speeds. I was seeing stars. I knew it was a matter of minutes until the end, if not seconds. I squeezed the trigger. The gun went off right beside its head, missing it by a few inches. I was done. It howled in pain and fear at the sound and the heat of the round going off. Amazingly, it let go of the gun. I aimed at its head and squeezed the trigger again. Blood rained on me as its head snapped back and it fell into the bed of the truck with a heavy thump. I sat the gun on the seat beside me as I breathed huge gulps of air, wiping the blood out of my eyes. My vision returned just in time for the turn onto the main road. The tires screeched as they bit into the asphalt on the way to the ranger station. I got there shortly after sunrise, pulled into a parking space, and sat back in the seat. Exhaustion and adrenaline crash sapped my energy. I fell asleep. I woke to the sound of someone knocking on my window. I whipped around, grabbed the gun off the seat, and swung it back around at the window. "Whoa there, son," the older ranger said, raising his hands. "What's got your panties in a bunch?" I took a deep breath, lowered the gun in the window, then told him the whole story. The longer I went, the more serious he became. Until the story was done, his face was made of granite. He stuck his hand in the window. "Keys," he said. I pulled the keys out of the ignition and handed them to him. "Go inside and get yourself cleaned up," he said. "I'll take care of this." I stepped out of the truck on shaky legs and walked into the ranger station, threw away my bloody uniform, and took a long shower. By the time I had finished and changed into a fresh uniform, the other ranger was back. He stepped inside the station and scanned the room until he found me. "All taken care of," he said with a crooked smile. "What do you mean?" I said. "Did you call the police?" He looked around at the handful of rangers that were milling around the room, trying to make it look like they weren't listening to our conversation. "Yeah, we're not gonna get the police involved in this," he said. "What? Why not?" He looked at me with an odd determination in his eyes. "So you really killed her, did ya?" he said. "Of course, it was her or me. Most of the folks around here give that place a wide berth," he said. "There's signs all over saying no trespassing and danger. You'd think it was almost natural selection for those who ignore all the warnings. But those travelers. And then there are others who visit the place on the down low, all quiet like," he said as if I hadn't said anything. "Those folks might say you robbed them of their fun. You might even call them conjugal visits. There might even be some of those folks in this very room." I stared at him in disbelief, then looked around the room and saw every set of eyes focused on me. There wasn't a smile or even a hint of one that suggested this was a joke. He clapped his hand on my shoulder. "Why don't you head home and rest today?" he said. "You've had a long night. We'll take care of things." He ushered me toward the door, pausing before opening it. "Just remember that nothing happened," he said. "Because if the police get an anonymous phone call, we might have to drive out and grab a couple of children to come visit your house in the middle of the night. You get me?" I nodded my head in a daze as he opened the door. That's the story I tell when people don't take the hint and stay away from the town. It's been years, and every once in a while, I hear of travelers that disappeared in the area. I shake my head and wonder. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.